Yeah, regarding the shift in our program, I would therefore continue with our keynote speaker for today. And I'm extremely pleased to be able to announce Dr. Lea Fünfschilling. She is an associate senior lecturer at the Center for Innovation Research at Lund University in Sweden, and holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Basel, Switzerland. Her research interests are the dynamics of sustainability transitions in various industries, including water, chemicals, transport, or forestry. And within this, especially understanding transitions as deinstitutionalization processes of socio-technical systems and the role of transformative innovation policies. She's the coordinator of the Swedish Transformative Innovation Policy Platform, STIP, and an active board member of the Sustainability Transitions Research Network. And very interesting, of course, she has very recently been awarded an ERC starting grant for her project Endings, towards a theory of endings in innovation studies, which will start next year. So maybe you will refer to that, but the floor is yours, Lea. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Mark, for the invitation and the whole Leibniz-Gemeinschaft. It's very nice to be here in Berlin in person. It's my first after Corona kind of presentation, so I'm very happy to be here and to kick off this discussion about missions, about governance, about transitions, and where we might go from here. I hope that my introductory remarks are, let's say, controversial or provocative enough that you have something to discuss today. And I'm very curious to hear, of course, what you are thinking, and also online. I'm not sure exactly where I need to look for online, probably there. Anyways, I will say a few words about the question of the relationship between innovation and sustainability, and in particular ask the question, are they friends or are they foes? I will make three major points today. First, talk a little bit about the connection between sustainability and transitions, so the role of deep structural socio-technical change for sustainability transitions, how that has come about. Then the question of how transitions are related to innovation, meaning the role of innovation for structural socio-technical change. And then reflect a bit on the question of innovation and sustainability, so meaning the role of innovation for sustainability and especially implications for policy in that regard. So sustainability and transitions, as Mark alluded to, I'm a sociologist by training, and I work mainly on questions on transitions. And so the basic assumptions, usually, how transitions and sustainability have become connected is that sustainability requires changes, and especially changes of production and consumption practices. But these changes are not in any way just any type of changes, but I think we can say they have three particular characteristics. On the one hand, we think of them as systemic. So we believe there's a lot of interdependencies between the different elements that we have in society or in the socio-technical system. We think of them as socio-technical. So we look at the co-evolution of material and social elements, often also institutions and technologies, but there's a little bit, I would say, the systemicness of it all is deeply rooted in a socio-technical understanding of society. And the changes should also be deep structural, meaning in some form radical, meaning path breaking. We do not usually believe incremental changes to be sufficient to reach any type of sustainability goals. So that's how sustainability transitions, that kind of research area has come about, but also how I think we can safely say that all types of sustainability questions are related to questions of change. But then how did we get to innovation? So I think we can safely say that since this sustainability transition occurrence, and that has become a real lively academic community and also has had a huge impact in policy, the way policy is phrased around these issues, I think you can safely say that that has become kind of a new heyday of innovation as a concept, as an idea. And I think the link between innovation and change is usually through the notion of creative destruction, this very classic Schumpeterian idea that once we have innovation, or innovation as such is powerful enough to break with whatever existing stability we have, and that can lead and open up possibilities for something new. And this idea of creative destruction, and therefore the very important role of innovation for transition, to trigger transitions, has been really, really deeply rooted in many theoretical frameworks that probably many of us refer to or use when trying to make sense of transitions, such as the multi-level perspective, strategic niche management, technological innovation system, or all other innovation systems for that matter. In the multi-level perspective, we have the idea of the niche, which is maybe more a socio-technical type of innovation, a socio-technical configurational innovation, but nevertheless, a lot of idea about something new, novel, will arise, will institutionalize, and eventually diffuse and replace. Now, for the purpose of this talk, I would like to argue that innovations usually prove very insufficient for replacing existing and established socio-technical systems. So one could argue that it is in fact rather strange that we have had such a big emphasis on innovation as an important vehicle through which to get to change, through which to get to sustainability. And I'll make this argument referring to four major insights that we have from different theories. On the one hand, we usually know that path dependency is the rule, so that it's incremental innovation and radical innovation, the way that we might think leads to creative destruction, is very rare. And we have, mainly in innovation studies, gathered a lot of evidence that actually radical innovation is really, really rare. And so it's somewhat baffling to me that something so rare becomes such a center of our hope for sustainability. On the other hand, we also know a lot about coevolution and about socio-technical regimes. We talk a lot about the actual stability of socio-technical system. We talk a lot about how things actually, the general go-to state that we find is a lot of really stable systems, and that stems from coevolution of institutions, technologies, actors, and that has led to a lot of really entrenched socio-technical regimes. And these regimes then are the reason for why innovation is very rarely path-breaking, but a lot more often very much incremental in nature. A third argument, which might show that innovation is not necessarily the most likely thing to happen for a transition, is that a lot of research, especially in institutional theory, has looked at decoupling, at symbolic changes, meaning a lot of the things that humans do are very ceremonial in nature, and most often actually lead to the perpetuation of what we already have, and not necessarily to any change. And especially innovation has been used very, very often to kind of more symbolically show that, for instance, a firm is engaging in certain types of activities, etc. And we see a lot of decoupling from the core activities compared to maybe a more discursive line of argument that we see in the media, in reports, etc. So a lot of symbolic changes and not really the real changes either. And the fourth element that could also question the role of innovation for transitions is the notion of deep transitions, or the notion of multi-level effects, meaning that we have seen that very often, whether or not an innovation actually leads to any type of sustainability transition, meaning to any type of deep structural changes, has very often to do with what level we're looking at and we're studying. And we have seen in many quite nice work from sociology, but also in the transitions community, that a lot of innovations might be very radical at one level, but if you then look at the more global level, at the more societal level, they actually contribute to the establishment and the entrenchment of already values that are already around, such as all types of capitalistic values, all types of other broader societal structures that we then see that they are being persisted. And I think we all know that many sustainability technologies or technologies that are thought of as sustainable in some areas might be argued to be really unsustainable or perpetuating the status quo in other areas. So these are 4 things that I think are quite important to think about when we're thinking about the role of innovation for transitions. And the reason I'm saying, or I'm kind of focusing in on the role of innovation for transition is for the implications that has when we talk about sustainability, or the role of innovation for sustainability and not just for transition. So on the one hand, yes, I do believe we have in many respects quite an innovation bias based on this notion of creative destruction that very rarely occurs, but also that we have in many regards a conflation of innovation and change. So many people use it interchangeably almost, even though these are two very different societal phenomenon that should not be seen as the same. And I think one of the histories of that conflation comes from the fact that for a long period of time we talked about innovation, and at some point we talked about innovation systems. So we kind of had a lot of insight into how innovation comes about, and we all agreed that it's a systemic thing, and we developed as academics, several innovation systems literature. And then, for some reason, a shift came towards system innovation, equating innovation with change. So moving towards basically saying system innovation is transition, meaning that innovation, basically every change is innovation. And I think this is quite problematic, especially when we talk about governance. And we see this when looking at all these new frameworks that come across when we talk about how to govern sustainability transitions. They're very often rooted in innovation policy. So we have transformative innovation policy, mission-oriented innovation policy, a lot of other types of new innovation policies, holistic innovation policies, you have it. So there seems to be a very clear correlation between these new types of governance of transitions with the link to innovation. And my question to you all for the discussion maybe is, what is the role really of innovation for broader system change, and especially in regard to sustainability? Couldn't we also argue that we have generated a lot of innovations necessary for sustainability, but actually they don't diffuse, but actually they're not accepted, but actually we are stuck in something else than just the innovation phase? And then, of course, the big question comes, what are the limitations of innovation policy in responding to societal challenges? So if we make this tight coupling always to sustainability transitions is kind of a matter of innovation policy, my argument would be that we lose a lot of the other policy areas that could also be very beneficial in addressing sustainability challenges. And at least from my work with Sweden, I know that a lot of the newer innovation policy, the mission in particular, they're all located at innovation agencies. But innovation agencies, like Mark also pointed out before, they have often been founded to support the existing sectors, the existing industries, to make them competitive, to have national growth, whatever you want, but they have not been created, or they don't work as a transition agency. These are two very different things. And so the question, where do they overlap, but also maybe where do we need to open up for other types of governance approaches that might not actually be related to innovation at all? And that said, where can we make innovation, the classical innovation policy, more transformative without making it a policy that has nothing to do with innovation? So another question then, of course, becomes, or is in the, that I want to put into the room, whether or not that for new things to emerge and institutionalize, other things need to disappear. And this is the link to the ERC project that you mentioned, Mark. The big question, what else besides innovation, when that is so unlikely to be disruptive, when that is so unlikely to be having the creative destruction, what else could lead to the deinstitutionalization of our current systems, our current structures, our current societal modes? And I think there's quite a bit of work in the transitions community being done on this topic at the moment. It is usually under various different headers, and it's only in its infancy, because also there in the transitions community, a lot of people are innovation scholars. So if you don't look at innovation, who else could be in the transitions community, and what's really the essence of sustainability transitions if you take the innovation part out? But there are very good work being done at the moment on regime destabilization, on questions of phase-out policies, on discontinuation as a governance problem. That I think was a whole project, and I think it's a very nice way of framing it. We have also deliberate decline for decarbonization, and the big questions of unlearning, unmaking, how can we get rid of things, maybe even without replacing them. And then the notion that's maybe more in the innovation literature, they have come up with questions of ex-innovation. So how do we, especially on firm level, get rid of certain aspects? So these are my introductory remarks or inputs, and I hope this kicks off a nice discussion, and I'm looking forward to having that discussion with you guys and meeting you over the next 2 days. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Lea. Excellent start for our conference and for our discussion, I think. And of course, we are here to collect also questions that would come both from online, but also from the present audience here. And I think I'd start a little bit with the audience here in the auditorium to see whether there are concrete questions coming back to Lea on her presentations. Roman Mendle. No, I think that there is a microphone coming.
Thanks a lot for a great presentation. My name is Roman Mendle. I work for ICLEI on one of the missions, the city's mission to be specific. My question to you is, to what extent do you think there may be another side of the coin to innovation and change, in the sense of that when we talk about sustainability, some concepts are conservation, preservation, things like this, maybe also in terms of renovation. This is maybe a term that we're more familiar with from the building sector, but basically the idea of taking things that are there and upgrading, improving them, rather than deconstructing them completely. Is this another side of the coin to the debate that you see? And then if yes, how do you see the dichotomy between those two different concepts? How can we maybe as practical change makers also look at things that are good, that are there, integrate them into change making without throwing the baby out with the bathwater? That would be my question to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think it might not be the other side of the coin, but rather just another issue. I'm not too big a fan of thinking in dichotomies, because it really waters down the actual issues that we know. But I think you're really onto something regarding the correlation between conservation versus innovation. So what do we keep from the old? Do we have to throw everything out? How much can stay and still be sustainable? And I think at least in the theoretical work, we have a lot of questions around originally there was the idea that a transition is this deep structural change. So you throw out basically every element. There's nothing that was there before is there after. And I mean, by now we know that all of these elements themselves, they can also change. So you can have, firms can change. But the question always is, to what degree can you change and still be the same, or still you're something else eventually, maybe with the same name, etc. But I think it's a very important question to say where innovation in society is necessary and likely and also warranted and welcomed, and where do we actually go the other way around. Now I know hardcore innovation studies people, they would tell you that for conservation you need a lot of innovation. So we need new ways of conserving. We need new ways of looking at how to keep things alive and make that distinction of what stays and what goes. My personal view on this is that if everything becomes innovation, and if everything that's innovation is change, and every change is innovation, it waters down the idea of innovation. So I like more analytical clarity, so I would rather say, no, this is a different setting that I would completely agree with you is really important to look at, as to not just focus only on how do we get rid of everything and how do we change everything.
Yeah, thank you. Further questions? Katharina Helming, we're going to share the microphone.
Yes, thank you very much for the intriguing talk. My question is to scale. Your critique or the challenges related to innovation, is it different at different, let's say, levels of governance and implementation from the local to the global?
Yes, I would say it is. On the one side, it depends whether you mean the challenges to generate innovation are different, and or the effects of innovation are different. So I think the more local you go, the more easily something seems new. So geography has a whole list of new path development, for instance, where it's also that it's new to the region, for instance. So it can be something that's institutionalized somewhere else completely, but if it's new to the region or a city or a local ministry, then it's an innovation. So I guess there I would say it depends on what is interesting to you, but when we're talking about making change, making deep structural change, there's nothing more incremental than having the symbolic flag up for innovation when all you do is basically copy-paste from what is already existing. So then I think it's watering down, it's exactly the symbolic changes again. But in terms of innovation, I think you cannot have, if you look geographically, a global innovation might only be, an analytical concept, because everything is always somewhat place-based and grounded and anchored. So I would say these are very much connected, these concepts.
Yeah, further questions?
Yes.
Philippe Larue.
Thank you very much for your talk. If I try to follow your argument, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a bit sketchy, but you start from this conflation of innovation and change and say that you look and you see, well, there is not that much change, so maybe we need something else than innovation. You're kind of disappointed with the change, as we all are, unfortunately. This deep structural change does not happen, the transition does not happen, and we're maybe not even on the good way. So I share that. Now I take maybe a different conclusion. It's not that we need something else than innovation. It may be our notion, our understanding of what innovation is that is not correct, in the sense that it's much too narrow, as we all know. So we don't need something else than innovation, but we need more of it and something different in terms of not only technological innovation, but also innovation in policy innovation. We need governance innovation. We need public sector innovation. We need innovation that relate, as you said, sustainability is not only about modes of production, it's also the demand side. So we need to change modes of consumption. We need to address behavioral change, and how can policy support behavioral change. So you see, I don't know how far I am from you, but I see it from a different angle. And just to make the link now to mission, analytically, let's say theoretically, mission is supposed to be that new approach that would help us having this systemic and holistic view where we would take all the changes that are needed for a given problem. So whether we need technological change, okay, but also other types of changes, changes in modes of behaviors and consumptions and all that. Now, unfortunately, I will say tomorrow that maybe it's not the silver bullet, because everything that you said can be applied also to mission. It's kind of invaded mission in the sense that we see a lot of symbolic change. We call that mission washing. We see many of those things. We see a lot of technological missions and not that many missions that are really systemic. But still, it's on the good way. And just to take the example that you took, you mentioned the Swedish innovation agencies. So let's say Vinnova, and you say they are, one of the problems is that they are here to protect some incumbents, maybe. They were here for that. I'm not totally sure this is it's maybe not the issue. Again, the issue might be more fundamental, is that it's an innovation agency. And so they're not here to protect the incumbents, but they're here to support technological innovation mainly, although they define themselves as systemic agency, I think, or something like that. But still, and this is what we see in many of those mission initiatives. They are led by research ministry, by innovation agency, and so they come here to the glass ceiling, in the sense that they cannot use research or innovation money to do something else. So here we come to the limit, and this is where we need a new mode of governance and even budgeting and all that. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think we're on very much the same page. I mean, especially with your last remarks, that's exactly my observation, that you get to this glass ceiling if you focus on innovation, because what you really want is change. And the way that you have, you know, all the other types of innovation you mentioned, I would say eventually we get to this point where it becomes meaningless to just call everything an innovation just because it's new, and meaningless not just because it loses this like linguistic, it becomes linguistic nonsense to call everything the same thing, but also that we lack the tools to then really talk about the classical sense of innovation. Meaning, you know, this is one pillar, and I do believe that, but I am an innovation scholar, so I do believe there is a role for innovation, and especially STI policy, so science, technology policy, to really address it in a way that will lead to more sustainable change down the road. And that is washed through, if we are washed out or washed away, if everything becomes innovation. So, you know, addressing emission, parts of it is innovation. And then there's a lot of other things. But my point is that as long as we have that conflation, it ends up at Vinnova. And they're doing a great job, and I really don't want to, they're having such a, you know, hard time to, as a policymaker, be given that kind of, yeah, it's like from the government, here's your job, now your transitions somehow as well, and then everyone needs to come up with new ways of how to do mission. And like you say, they don't have the tools. They're not allowed to change any budgets. They're not allowed to tell the financial ministry what to do or how to deal with it. So that's where I'm thinking, if we make that clear distinction between what do we call innovation and what do we call other changes that clearly need to happen, it might be easier, especially for policy, to be clear about where that is located. Because for now, and that might be a provocative statement, it looks like a kind of occupational therapy thing that we all do, that we say symbolically, we're all busy working on this with the missions, but we leave it at the innovation agency so as to not really make any changes. Because we all know this is not where the biggest changes and biggest power within the government would lie. So my, I think, plea would be, if we can reduce that, then maybe the others become a bit more visible, that they're not contributing, that they're not actually part of this discussion, that the whole question of sustainability is being outsourced, like back in the days with experimentation. Everyone wanted to do experimentation, which is basically another name of we don't want to have any real change, we just want to experiment. Take this one house to look at new technologies. Take a little district in a city to look at something else. It buys you as a politician about 10 years. You can flag your thing and say, I'm still doing it, but you also protect everyone, you know, investing in all other types of things And that's where I think if we detach it a bit, it becomes obvious that other ministries and agencies, other than innovation agencies, should be involved in this question.
So can I just also, with a view to the online audience, encourage you to post your questions in the chat. We are, of course, monitoring that. So we come to you in a second, but we have another question also here in the audience. Heribert Hofer, please.
Thank you very much for your highly instructive talk. I'd like to get back to the sustainability a bit. And if I look at innovation from the sustainability perspective, having lived in East Africa for 30 years, it seems that change is definitely happening, but whatever people at the time describe as innovation is by necessity associated also with loss. And that seems to be missing here. Not only does it seem to have that new things are being introduced, but other things are being lost. In terms of, if you look in agriculture, there used to be dozens, if not hundreds of varieties of particular food plants. Now we have very, very few. There was innovation once because they produced higher yields. We've lost the variability and the flexibility to adjust to maybe slightly different environmental conditions. Many traditional societies know how to cope with scarcity of resources of all sorts of kinds. In the course of the past 100 years, we seem to have lost many of those ways of handling scarcity of whatever. So I'd like to hear your comments on this. Am I looking at this from a too narrow point of view?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this. No, not at all. I think the question of loss is very closely related to things that I will also address in the ERC project that Mark mentioned about endings. And endings, I mean, innovation usually means that we're doing something differently now. And that by definition means that someone is losing, someone needs to do something differently. But I think culturally, we have, I mean, innovation being very much an IT kind of Silicon Valley, American type of thing where a lot of new is associated as good, as better, and if it leads to any form of progress in the sense that you then define it at this particular moment in time, which was very often just some form of growth, then there was no room for mourning for anyone, because that was the better things. I mean, we see that in agriculture a lot, also with the sizes of farming. I've never met farmers who said, no, I really like the factory farming. It's just, it has, a lot of technological innovations especially have made certain other things obsolete, but not necessarily better for certain amounts of people or regions, etc. And I think this has gotten completely lost in the very hype of innovation being, understood as the core for national wealth, the main trigger for any kind of national competitiveness. And as long as you tie innovation so clearly to well-being and welfare, it's very hard to say something against it. But I think now there are more and more voices coming out to also, show the detrimental downside of a lot of the innovations that just diffused without anyone actually ever having a say. It wasn't democratic. It just, a lot of the, especially also technological innovations, but also some of the social innovations like we see with a lot of the sharing economy, as they call it, or gig economy, a lot of those things are really, really detrimental for a lot of people. But also they are shadowed over by the few that profit from it. And I think in regard to sustainability, we need to take these voices back in and see how that goes together with a more holistic idea of welfare, progress. Yeah.
Yeah, I see no further questions here in the audience, and we'd turn towards, there is. Sorry, Achim Schlüter. Needs a mic?
Thanks a lot. I enjoyed very much your talk, and I also enjoy very much the discussion. as an economist, potentially I have to say something about Schumpeter. And I was just wondering, okay, if I remember, it was quite a long time ago that I read Schumpeter, but I mean, what we are focusing on in innovation currently is basically what I think he called inventions, and this aspect of that I'm recombination the factors and that I'm basically bringing them to the market and I make them used in the society potentially. That's not the focus currently, and if I understood well your talk, that's also something you criticized. And then on the other hand, as an economist, I'm just wondering, could you expand a little bit more? I mean, Schumpeter was just an economist to a certain degree, yeah? So from that perspective, he was looking at innovations in the marketplace, yeah? And what we need basically are a lot of innovations in society, yeah? And that would be interesting to learn a little bit more in how you would compare those two different forms of innovation. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Schumpeter was an economist, although I think, you know, back then there was not really that many different clans you could be part of. So I'm not sure he would fully subscribe to only his economist existence. But in general, I think what you're saying is absolutely right, that there is a lot of his work goes into the question of how the diffusion, so the actual innovation, making it worthwhile in the market. But nevertheless, I think what I'm usually not sure about is how much that applies to, you know, for types of innovation and diffusion that aren't just accepted because they, at least in the market, lead to very clear gains. So the way he described a lot of things is very descriptive, meaning things happened that way. But what we're with sustainability looking at, there's no problem. I mean, if you want to go to, you know, innovation agencies and where they fund innovation, I don't think many are involved in any of the, you know, Spotifys and Facebooks these days. These things just happen, and they're I mean, with a lot of research and innovation policy behind in the other kind of the basic research, if you will. But it's a different dynamic than having to diffuse something that is considered unpopular, that is considered, you know, not immediately making any gains for a human being or a family or a household, but that actually needs some translation to see that we have long-term effects. We have, I mean, the pedagogical effort to explain to someone the costs of climate change it's just, you know, this is where we could probably all spend our time, and it would be very well invested if more people would understand, you know, immediate benefits and long-term benefits, etc. So that's one observation that I have to Schumpeter. So I'm not sure he would have the same type of theories if he would have looked at, let's say, green innovation, even if you stay on the firm level and you just deal with the market. And the second part of your question, as a sociologist, I see a lot of connection between society and the market, and for me markets are very much, you know, socially constructed. So I think from transition research, we know that we need innovation on all fronts, but it's a myth that you have it in the private sector, in the market, in the firm, and then it just affects everyone else. But it's also a myth, I think, that a lot of the mission stuff has come up, you know, that it's state-driven and in any way. So I think there's really what we see in the empirical research is a lot of actors are doing things. And on the other end, stuff happens. And sometimes you see certain patterns. What do firms traditionally do, public actors traditionally do, etc. And that makes sense to tease that apart. But for sustainability transitions, I would argue it's better not to compartmentalize the idea that certain actors are more relevant or are more, should be more funded, should be more urgently forced to do things than others. On the other hand, we know where a lot of the pollution happens, where a lot of the emissions happen, where a lot of the business models gone wrong happen. So there is a part to play for private firms in that sense, for sure. Interestingly, though, we also see a lot of the firms being at the forefront of a lot of the policy discussions, you know, going to to public actors, shaking them and saying, we need regulation because, we don't have any cotton anymore and we know it's not going to come back, so we know we need to do something about textile recycling. So I think there's a lot of dynamics there, but definitely it's interconnected, I would argue.
Okay, take a final look into the audience, but I think now we can shift towards the online questions, and I'll ask Markus Egermann to give us some insights about what's coming up.
Yes, thanks Mark, thanks Lea for the talk. I start with a comment directly related to your last question. That's from Raimund Bleischwitz. He wrote that Schumpeter is useful for disruptive innovation and creative destruction and development, but sustainability would need to be added to that. And I leave that as a comment to the current discussions, but I have a couple of questions from the audience, and I tried to group it into pieces you may answer. The very first two questions were partly addressed, but maybe it gives you the opportunity to extend a bit on that. The first one is from Ulf Breuer. He asked, did I understood it correctly that you stated perhaps we already have enough innovations on sustainability, but people do not use them? And is it not a challenge to come up with innovations for sustainability that at the same time maintain or increase wealth or welfare? And the second question is from Judith Terstreep, is a very clear one. It's about the research and development agencies. And she asked, you made the point that research and development agencies are no change agencies, but couldn't they be? And I would add, how they could be. Maybe we start with that.
All right. No, of course. I really think every agent, every actor has the potential to become an agent of change. I don't think there's a particularly setup of actors that are absolutely not capable of acting as an agent for change. I think it's easier to identify where certain things might not, or where certain barriers are. So it's maybe more easier to identify the actors that are clearly standing in the way. But for research and development agencies, yes, absolutely. I could go on another talk about the role of research and transformative research for sustainability, and also the role of knowledge. And I think there is going to be today a session on questions around that. So really the role of academia as such, and then its policy partners that fund us. So what kind of knowledge do we want to develop? What kind of knowledge do we want to phase out? I don't know in your universities how it's looking, but in mine I know that revising a curricula is like a state affair and takes years. So it's very, very hard these days to actually bring innovative knowledge to students. We're very much bound to really old-time, not really updated types of theories that we still teach and thereby perpetuate. So I think in that sense, I very much believe in that research and development agencies are really much at the forefront, and can also be, if we use the missions approach, can also be given some directionality. Although I'm a firm believer of basic research and that should be free, and we never know where innovation is going to come from. So I think directionality needs to be managed very carefully if we don't want to miss the next big thing that actually might be a good thing for sustainability. But what we definitely can do more of is look at what comes out of research and development that we want to establish and institutionalize and diffuse. Not everything that academics invent needs to be necessarily spread, and there can be maybe a bigger societal exchange over that, I think. So that's my question to the research development agencies. You said how? Yeah, I can only say from my work with the Swedish innovation agency Vinnova, it is possible. There are a lot of people working on trying to make these things more directed, more sustainable, more open, more inclusive, and all of these things. And I do think it takes a lot of time and efforts and resources that none of these agencies currently have. So if we're serious about making agencies entrepreneurial, we need to give them more resources to be able to do so. Otherwise, it's a side business, it's a side group, it's 3-4 people that get a special office, and the rest is business as usual. So as always, if we're serious, the resources should go there. And the first question, you have to remind me.
Yes, I like to remind you, and I connected to another one which is very close to that. You were very critical on innovations, on the term. And there was the question, do we have enough innovations?
Oh, yeah.
That was your statement. And is that really the case? Or do we need more other innovations which are more connected to wealth and health? And I connected with a question from Artem Kozhanevich, and he asked, how should we deal with the term innovation? So do you think it's still the right term to use for, or is it maybe not a good idea to use it because of all the old discourses which are connected to that? So should we stick to the term, or should we maybe try to enlarge or redefine it a bit and broaden it?
Yes, so the question, do we have enough innovation? I don't think we'll ever have enough innovation. I believe in a very dynamic society. Every day we go out and people do things and new things come up. So no, there's never going to be enough. But I think it's tricky to think like if we only have more, or if we only have the right ones, that then the sustainability thing would be solved. And that brings me to this distinction with the term innovation and what I think is change or transitions that people are talking about. And the moment we separate these better, I think we're going to be able to talk about the phenomenon of transitions without always having to talk about innovation as such. Then we can talk about conservation, we can talk about destabilization, we can talk about loss, we can talk about religion, routines, all types of things that are not innovation. And then maybe the innovation agency doesn't have to be involved, but many other departments of the public sector can, and many citizens as well. So.
Yes, thanks, Lea. And there's one more question from the chat, and this really leads us to the core topic of our conference today. It's from Raimund Bleischwitz, and he asks, what is the role of mission in your eyes? Do they direct or shape the direction, or is there a risk of becoming too deterministic or even too top-down? And he refers to man on the moon idea. And he asked if you have any reflections on the approach of Mazzucato, which is one of the main persons promoting visions, as you know.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to completely take a stand on all the different of all my colleagues' work at this stage, but I will say that there is something in my work with policymakers, and maybe some of you are and can relate to that. The mission statement can sometimes feel a bit offensive because it sounds like the previous 60 years policymakers did things without a mission, without a purpose, without a goal. And I think this is, that it has in the communication sometimes a little bit the danger that you lose an audience if they're not willing to accept it or are insulted by it. On the other hand, I know that it can fly very well. And I always keep saying that for us as academics, it's probably the most humbling thing to realize that a theory does not have to be true to be working out for people. It's not a matter of whether or not what's written about mission has any scientific value in our field, because it clearly works for some people, for some governments, for some agencies to get the change through that they wanted. So I think, and this is where I don't want to discuss necessarily the ins and outs of mission-oriented innovation policy versus all other types of innovation policies. There are these review articles out there. We have PhD students dissecting this. What's the difference? What do they say? But what we all know is that it has not been filled, mission or any other new innovation policy framework, with any type of evidence really just yet. So I think we're very much dependent on, the world happening and people making changes and trying to intervene in the system so that we can study how that affected things. And then after a while we can see we have something to go on. Before that, it's just, it's nice words that don't necessarily have the effect that we might all want to have. So I'm always very in favor of substantiating words, especially the ones that fly so easily off the tongue and seem to work in several settings. That usually means that we all think we talk about the same thing, but actually everyone is thinking something else, but it's just a convenient boundary object, which we know from sociology is really important to have if you want to have change. So there's a bit this, you know, if it works, fine, great, but let's not think that it's in any way, you know, fundamentally developed so that we have it ready in the ivory tower and can give it to practitioners to say, like, we figured it out, here you go. So I think we're all in this, and it's very important that the experiences on the ground will be used to feed into theorizing about the coming future. And just one last sentence about the man on the moon. Well, that was fueled by a lot of different things that it is today. And I don't think you had to convince many people about the man on the moon thing. And also, I don't think many people were asked, or even anyone was asked, whether or not they wanted to put all their money there. So I think it's actually, it's again something that works as a hook for a conversation, but if you go deep down and would, you know, dissect it analytically, I don't think any sustainability mission has anything to do with the man on the moon. So.
Yeah, I think that was a clear statement. and certainly with a view to your introductory remark, Lea, I think there have been quite a few ideas which were provocative enough for inspiring some discussion during these 2 days. Yeah, so many thanks again for your contribution.